From somewhere to his left there came a low hiss of "Psst." Yet amid the sounds of music, song, and chatter, the soft whisper escaped Peter. Matrix tapped him on the shoulder. "Hmm?" Matrix answered by pointing a limb towards the right end of the stage, just behind the piano. Peter looked along the slender limb and beyond. There, crouched at the end of the bar, stood a light brown-furred rat woman, beckoning for the duo to approach. She appeared to be one of the showgirls. She was clad in a dress of similar design, albeit of a different color and a few minor variations. Her eyes were large and bright, and her expression one of great earnest. A black dot, a false beauty mark, was painted just above her lip and behind her nose. Where rats were concerned, she might have been attractive, in a trashy sort of way. Peter glanced in either direction. Seeing no one else taking note of the woman, he discreetly pointed to himself and raised an eyebrow. She nodded eagerly in response and motioned Peter closer. Peter turned aside, stepping cautiously to the bar and then slipping down to the end. "Yes? Can I help you?"
"You're Peter Dang, right?"
"That's somewhat debatable," Peter mused. "I've also been called
"Mr. V's pal.
the woman clarified.
The genius."
"I don't care to blow my own horn," Peter answered, "and I would hardly have considered Mr. Vincetti and myself pals, although—"
"Did you or did you not get a letter asking for help?"
Peter raised a curious eyebrow. "And what, might I ask, would you know about that?" The rat woman glanced cautiously about her surroundings.
"Come with me, okay? Backstage."
There was little the two rats could have done to hide their actions. There wasn't a single rat in the place that didn't see them slip away. Eddie G. nodded across the room to Bill from the bilge. "Follow 'em, see where they go." Bill emptied his drink in a single gulp, and wiping his mouth off on the back of his arm, he slunk past the piano after Peter and his pretty new friend. Peter was led up a small set of stairs at the far end of the stage. From there, he and his mysterious contact slipped behind the curtains. Shadows of women dancing flickered across the cloth on one side, and crude graffiti leered down from the brickwork on the other. At the other end of the stage, the rat woman made a right-hand turn, leading down a short, narrow hallway. A moment later, she came to a door in the right wall. She turned the knob and peered inside. Then she motioned for Peter to follow her. There were cabinets and wardrobes on either side of the door as Peter entered. The far wall was taken up by a countertop and a mirror. This was the first time Peter had seen the dressing room in person. Despite knowing every inch and corner of it in his mind, he found the room to be quite unfamiliar to his eyes. Peter raised his hand to the ceiling outside and whispered to Matrix, "Keep watch." The spider offered Peter a silent salute, and then scuttled up his arm, disappearing into the shadows outside. Peter left the door open a crack for Matrix to slip through should he need to sound the alarm. With that precaution taken, Peter then turned his attention to his strange companion. "All right. Now, unless I'm mistaken, you had something to tell me." She nodded. "Let's start with your name,
"Faye."
she answered.
"Yeah, Faye Beam."
"I don't recall your face."
"Yeah, well, it's not like you've been around for a while, have you?"
"True," Peter conceded. "So, Faye?"
"Miss Beam to you, smarty."
Peter paused. "Miss Beam, then. The pigeon sky rat said a woman had given him a message. I assume he referred to you?" Faye nodded.
"Yeah, me."
"And what of Mr. Vincetti?" Peter pulled out the note, surveying the lettering for a moment. "This is his handwriting, so unless you managed to forge it, he must have been alive at the time you sent it out." Faye didn't immediately answer. She leaned close, peering up into Peter's face. "Is something the matter?" Faye shook her head.
"Nah, just making sure it's really you."
"Enough games," Peter said sharply, grabbing Faye by the shoulders. "Where is Charles Vincetti?" Faye answered with a stomp on Peter's foot, sending him staggering as he clutched at it more in shock than pain.
"He's safe. I stashed him in your old workshop."
"I see." Peter winced as he straightened up. "Then the trick is to go there without rousing suspicion." Just then, Matrix scuttled in along the ceiling, chittering madly. Faye gulped.
First, we gotta get out of here without Rousing
suspicion, Peter cut her off.
Yeah, that.
Quickly, follow my lead, Peter whispered. Then he grabbed Faye around the waist, and not a moment too soon. The door swung open with a slam as it smashed against the wall. Bill Dawson lurched into the room, his hook buried firmly in the door's wood. His eyes narrowed for just a moment as he reached his free hand for his chain. Then he came to an abrupt stop, cigar drooping as he laid eyes on the scene within. Peter and Faye were entwined in a somewhat less than passionate embrace, lips locked in a full-on French-style kiss, or as close to one as two rats could come. Very softly, Faye moaned in pleasure. Bill tipped his hat back, cigar rising as his teeth pressed into a tight grin, and he leaned against the door frame, lightly twirling his tail as he watched. After a time, two sets of eyes opened, glancing towards the door, and Peter and Faye loosened their hold, turning their heads to glare at Bill. "Don't stop on my account! I love a good peep show!" Faye frowned, giving Peter a harsh push backwards and sending him stumbling into a nearby wardrobe.
Do you mind? This here's private, capiche?
As Faye stalked towards Bill in a huff, and even as she relentlessly swatted his face and shoulders, the dirty rat simply laughed. "Ha! I love a lady with spirit!" Then Faye grabbed the door and slammed it in Bill's face. As it slowly rattled back open, Bill spat out a small yellowish object, what appeared to be a tooth knocked loose.
Well?
Faye demanded, setting her hands on her hips.
How many more do I have to smash out?
Bill simply grinned, flashing the recently vacated gap in his teeth. He wrenched his hook from the door and gave Faye a mocking tip of his bowler as he ducked out, and vanished into the hallway beyond. Faye peered out the door after Bill, just in time to see him disappear around a corner. Slipping back in the dressing room, Faye then rushed over to a wardrobe and threw the doors open. Inside, surrounded by clothes fallen from their hangers, she found Peter, a sequined red dress slipped over his jacket, and his hands poking out from under the skirt, while his eyes spun in a daze. Faye promptly slapped Peter hard enough to send his cap flying. Blinking in surprise, Peter exclaimed, "What on earth was that for?"
Next time, you ask first.
Faye snapped. With a coy smirk, she added,
I promise I'll say yes.
Peter peeled the dress off and retrieved his cap. "I don't believe that should be necessary."
Of course it should.
Faye exclaimed.
It's the gentleman type thing to do.
Peter dusted himself off as he stood up and gave Faye a quizzical look. "What I meant was, our ruse paid off, and it shouldn't prove necessary to use it again." Faye's expression immediately sagged.
Oh, I get it. You swing the other way, huh?
"I'm not really a swinger, Miss Beam," Peter answered, reaching a hand towards the ceiling. Matrix hopped down to Peter's arm and, crawling to his shoulder, began whispering softly in Peter's ear. Peter's eyebrows rose in tandem into a look of alarm. "What? Really?" Matrix nodded. Peter glanced back to Faye, just the slightest bit red-faced. "I understand. I'm terribly sorry, Miss Beam, but I've never really given the matter much thought. I've always had more important matters to consider, you see."
More important than finding love?
Faye asked. "Indeed," Peter mused, peering out the door. "For instance, the matter of our mutual pal."
Oh, yeah.
Faye perked up, suddenly recalling the matter of the moment.
Come with me. We'll take the back way out.
Peter glanced over his shoulder, raising an eyebrow. "I didn't design this place with a back way, as you called it."
I know.
Faye scurried out the door, and after a quick look in either direction, darted to the right.
I added one.
Peter emerged and watched with a curious eye as Faye pushed out a loose brick and slipped through the new opening. Intriguing. As he followed Faye through, Peter found himself back in the alley. "Amazing," Peter breathed. "I take it you did this yourself." Faye blushed.
This This was nothing. The real work was patching up Mr. V after Eddie filled him with lead.
Peter's expression turned grim at the mention of Chubby Charlie's injuries. Yet even then, a flicker of admiration lingered on Peter's face. "Lead on, Miss Beam." Matrix hopped from Peter's shoulder to the wall and scuttled about for a better view of the alley, while Peter and Fay pushed the brick back into place. A moment later, he leapt back to Peter's shoulder as the two rats pulled away and set off for the far end of the alley. Great apes were few and far between on the sidewalk at that hour, making it safe and easy to venture outside the alley. It was a quick, short run down the edge of a building, and Peter was there. The entrance to his old den was much as Peter had left it, burned to ashes, leaving the edges of the brickwork blackened and charred. It still smelled like smoke as Peter stepped inside, onto the dusty stairway that led down into the dark. After living so long on the road in the sunlight, Peter found it difficult to see in the pitch black, and, much as Elizabeth had done during their first meeting, Peter slipped and lost his footing. With a yell, he slid down the stairs, the dull stone edges slamming into his back every step of the way, until he skidded to a halt at the bottom.
"Mr. D?"
Fay called down after Peter.
"Hey, Mr. D, you okay?"
Peter coughed, rolling onto his side and rubbing his aching back. "I will be, I believe." Fay arrived at the bottom shortly after Peter. A flame flickered to faint life as she lit an oil lamp, much like the one Peter used in the old days. Yet as he recalled, Bill from the Bilge had smashed that one and used its fire and oil to burn Peter's home and belongings to ash, so it couldn't have been the same lamp. Yet Peter only remembered building one. Such questions, however, would have to wait. As Fay helped Peter to his feet, he found himself confronted with more pressing matters. Peter's old work table was long gone, having been lost in the fire. Yet the workshop appeared to have been cleaned out. The remnants of Peter's destroyed furniture were gone. The new lamp sat on a wooden, rat-sized crate. The wall opposite was in shambles, having been smashed out by Monster with a sledgehammer on the day Peter left. On the other side of the crate, Peter spotted a corpulent form stretched out in a nest of rags. Peter barely recognized Chubby Charlie. The fat rat appeared to have shrunk since their last encounter, and his clothes were gone, replaced with a spiderweb pattern of stitches. Fay knelt at the unconscious rat's side. She rubbed his shoulder and whispered to him.
"Mr. V! Hey, Charlie! Your friend's here."
The huge rat's eyes cracked open as his head turned in Peter's direction. His mouth twisted into a rueful grin. Hey, Peter Dane, I almost didn't think you'd come." Peter, however, only frowned. "How could I not?" Chubby Charlie had no response, save to stare in sheer amazement. "Let's cut to the chase, shall we?" Peter broke the silence. "Give me the full story, or as full as you can manage. I've had a very long journey, and I'm wearying of this cloak and dagger nonsense." Chubby Charlie nodded and heaved himself into a sitting position. "It all started when the other territories started going quiet. Other rats just stopped talking to us, you know. The big cheese figured someone was planning a hit on him, so he called all of us back to his den. A few days went by, no action. Food started running low. Bill and Mickey were the first ones to crack. Went sneaking off to join up with one of the other bosses, get in good with the winners. A week later, they came back, white as a couple of topside sheets." Chubby Charlie heaved a painful cough, prompting Fay to rush to his side with a cup of water. Peter waited while the huge rat drank. At last he heaved a sigh and cleared his throat to go on. "They said they didn't find anyone. At least, not anyone alive. The other bosses were all dead, killed in their own dens, surrounded by bodies, every one of them burned to a crisp. And there were these crazy mice, all white, vicious, and plain fearless. Bill took a few swipes at them with his chain. They just ran in, biting and scratching, and ganged up on him." "White mice?" Peter repeated softly. A shadow of intense foreboding flashed across his face. White mice were rare in the wild. They would stand out like sore thumbs, making them easy marks for predators. "They must have come from a lab." "A what?" Chubby Charlie halted his story, a look of curiosity on his face.
A lab.
Fay repeated.
You know, a place where great apes do weird stuff to rats.
Among other things, yes, Peter agreed. Mice as well, and, well, really any creature not smart enough to avoid capture.
And you think these mice turned white in one of these labs?
Chubby Charlie asked. Peter shook his head. Unlikely. Rather, they would have been bred specifically for testing.
What, like some kind of schoolhouse?
Peter closed his eyes with a mournful sigh. If only, Mr. Vincetti, if only. Opening his eyes, Peter fixed Chubby Charlie with an intense stare. What happened next?
I woke up one night and heard the big cheese was dead. Bill found him just like the others, burned black. Some of the boys said they saw someone leaving, but no one got a good look at him. He was wearing a lot of dark clothes, right? A few days later, one of Natalini's boys shows up, talking about his new boss, right? Some joker calling himself Chop Chuck. Says the doc was the guy killing all the bosses.
Peter raised a curious eyebrow. So you aren't this Doc Chuck, then? A look of intense rage swept over Chubby Charlie's face.
No, I was loyal. Always been, always gonna be.
Eddie G seemed to think you were.
Yeah, he would say that.
The force faded from Chubby Charlie's expression as he winced in pain and leaned his head back against the edge of the nest.
I don't think there is a Doc Chuck. I think Eddie invented him so he could play both sides against the other.
Really? Peter mused. What on earth would he gain from that?
He cut my boys in half,
Chubby Charlie explained.
Made it easier for him to move on us. Joke's on him, though. Now we can't get what's left back together.
Peter nodded in silent thought. Perhaps, but that doesn't explain the killings.
Have you seen that fancy heater of his?
Chubby Charlie exclaimed. Indeed. There's the matter of these vicious mice. And what of the other gangs? What might have become of them?
I got 2 words for you,
Chubby Charlie quipped.
Fancy heater.
Peter shrugged. Perhaps. And there it was again, a complex weapon that should have been beyond the common street rat like Eddie G. Still, it might have been possible for Eddie to build one himself if he had access to the proper information, materials, and intellect. Matrix, Peter mumbled, eyes turning to the spider on his shoulder. Eh? Matrix squeaked, sitting up. It's time to call in the others. Find them and bring them here. But be sure to take an adjacent alley. We don't want Eddie or his men to know they're here. Matrix saluted Peter. Then he leapt to the nearest wall and scuttled away into the darkness. Now then, Peter turned to Fay. I think we had best be on our way. We don't want Eddie getting suspicious.
You got a plan, genius?
Fay asked. Peter shook his head. Not as yet. I need to know more about the men I'm dealing with. Their mindsets, their opinions.
What about the women?
Fay interjected. Peter raised an eyebrow in thought as he regarded her. Then he flashed a sly grin. Indeed. Glancing back to Chubby Charlie, he added, Stay here. Should the others arrive before I return, tell them to do the same. I'll be back as soon as I can. A short climb up the steps saw the 2 rats emerge from the hole in the wall. The sidewalk was empty, save for a great ape lurching far down the walk, or very far up. It was a clean, clear shot from the workshop back to the alley. Yet as Peter and Fay rounded the corner, their fur stood on end, and their nerves burst to electric life with the sounds of gunshots. And not just any gunshots. These were the rapid tap-tap hail spewing from Eddie's Tommy gun, followed with another rat-tat-tat in answer. Peter rushed ahead, darting straight for the tiny entrance to Mr. Biggs. Slipping through the crack, he peered around a corner, past the curtain hanging in the doorway, and saw the vision of carnage beyond. Not one cup in the place was intact, all of them having been shattered with bullets. Several tables had been upturned, forming a protective barrier near the far wall. Eddie occasionally poked his head up long enough to fire off a spray of bullets, and then ducked down to avoid his adversary's reprisal. A lean gray rat took cover behind the bar, and the floor between them was littered with bodies. many of them pale white, save for the crisscross pattern of blackened skin. Peter recognized the lab mice from personal experience and from Elizabeth's stories of her time in Utopia. She had called them biters. Peter ducked back around the corner as several bullets ricocheted off the walls. Slipping a hand into his breast pocket, Peter drew forth a curious little device. A tiny metal rod, small even by rat standards, wrapped in a steel wire whose ends were attached to a second rod. Peter curled his fingers around that second rod and gave it a tight squeeze. Then he peered around the corner and waited for his chance. Just as Eddie G ducked for cover, just as the gray rat stood up to fire another round, Peter burst from behind the curtain. His device hummed as it surged with electricity. The gray rat glanced in Peter's direction, just as the magnetic pull took hold, wrenching his gun off target and sending an erratic spray of bullets fanning out across the room. Peter's device connected in an instant, attaching itself to the barrel of the rat's gun with an iron grip. The rat tightened his hold and moved to squeeze the trigger as the barrel found itself pointing straight at Peter. Peter, however, wrenched the gun upwards, sending bullets ricocheting off the ceiling, and then shoved his way forward, forcing the gun barrel backwards. The other rat gave a shout of shock and pain as his own weapon smashed into his nose. Then both rats tumbled to the ground with a yell at the sound of gunfire from across the room. A coppery stench wafted up Peter's nostrils as his fallen opponent gasped in pain. The rat had been lucky. Only one bullet actually hit him, but it was in his shoulder, leaving his arm limp and useless. For all intents and purposes, the struggle was over. Peter stood up, tucking away his electromagnet, casting a cautious glance across the room. Eddie met Peter's gaze with a suspicious glare. He clambered over his makeshift barrier, gun aimed right at Peter. As he approached the bar, he glanced at the floor on the other side, making an eager note of the fallen rat. Glancing back up at Peter, Eddie gave him an approving nod.
"You're done good, Dane. Now hand me the rod."
Peter began to finger his pocket when Eddie cut him off.
"His gun, stupid! Hand me his gun!"
Peter looked down at the fallen rat and the blood pooling behind his shoulder. Reluctantly, Peter obeyed, prying the weapon from the rat's determined but weakened grip, and handed it to Eddie G. Eddie propped the stock of his own weapon against his shoulder, freeing up a hand to accept the new gun. Eddie then aimed the new gun at the fallen rat.
"The dark will see you now. In hell, you dirty rat!"
A peppering of bullets thundered from the weapon's barrel and ricocheted harmlessly off the ceiling as Peter abruptly forced it upwards. The rat on the floor let out a cry of fright in the rush. Eddie shot Peter an angry glare.
"You better have a real good reason for doing that, Dane."
"Your leadership stands on a knife's edge," Peter explained. "Tell me, what holds these men under your sway?"
"I don't sway," Eddie spat, "'cause I drink in moderation, see?"
Clearly Peter's meaning was lost on him.
"What I meant was, what keeps them in line?"
Eddie tapped his gun against his forehead in response.
"Precisely.
Fear. So what happens if they fear someone else more? This Doc Chuck fellow, for instance."
"What are you suggesting?"
Peter leaned close and whispered into Eddie's ear. "You've killed most of the attackers. Send this one back alive, with an offer. Anyone who wants to return to the old gang is welcome to do so. You'll simply forget any transgressions on their part up to now." Eddie snorted.
"You crazy? They'll think I went soft."
"Perhaps," Peter admitted, "but they'll also know they have a place by your side, and the ones who didn't return will show them what happens to those against you. It may serve to undermine Doc Chuck's hold over them." Peter paused a moment to let Eddie process his words. Then he added, "Every man who betrays Doc Chuck is one more on your side and one less on his." Eddie stared long and hard at Peter. Then he began to chuckle, and he bared his teeth in an unpleasant grin.
"I like your style, Pete."
He slapped Peter across the shoulders. Turning around, he addressed the other rats.
"Okay, boys, new plan."
Many glances shot past Eddie to drill their way into Peter as the boss explained Peter's proposal. Some of the rats appeared less than pleased with the prospect of showing mercy to their enemies, glaring hard and furious past Eddie to Peter. Others, however, nodded in approval, and a few even managed a half-smile, though only towards Eddie. Peter just had to settle for the angry glares. A couple of rats pulled their fallen foe from the floor and hauled him to a dirty little mat, where one of the showgirls set about digging the bullet from his wound and stitching it closed. The stage erupted into a celebratory song, despite the many bullet holes riddling the bar, tables, and curtains. In an instant, the mood of the place had changed. Peter noted the other rats, for the most part, didn't seem quite so grim. They still tiptoed around Eddie G, true, especially now that he carried 2 guns. Yet many appeared reinvigorated, as if someone had injected a few drops of life back into them. Peter heaved a sigh, and his legs turned to jelly. He slumped over to the bar, planting himself on a stool as his every limb wobbled and shook in time with the pounding of his heart. He took out a handkerchief and wiped it across his sweating brow. For just a moment, he even took off his cap to dab his head.
"What's your poison, Chief?"
Peter's eyes snapped open, and he eagerly replaced his cap, covering his scars and bald patches. What? Faye stood behind the bar, just across from Peter, grinning ear to ear.
"Drink, Mr. D. Drink. Pick a drink."
"Oh, some green tea, thank you." Faye stared at Peter as if he had sprouted a second head.
"Tea?"
"Yes, it does wonders for the nerves." Faye shrugged.
"Well, I'll see what we got."
Turning around, she tapped a finger against her lips in mock contemplation as she perused the shelves.
"We've got beer and beer. If you feel daring, we also got beer. And oh yeah, Mickey's stashed under the bar. More beer."
Peter chuckled as he rubbed his forehead. "What about ice water?" Faye smirked.
"'Fraid not, D-Man."
"Beer, then, would be lovely, but only a shot."
"You want it in a water gun?"
"You want it in a water gun?"
"You want it in a water gun?"
Peter collapsed into a mess of laughter, his nerves finally burning out for the night. Faye blinked before finding herself laughing uneasily along with him.
"And then what? I squirt it in your mouth?"
Peter rubbed his forehead, still shaking as he chuckled. "I don't mean a gunshot, but a shot, as in a shot glass, just a little at the bottom." Seeing the confused expression on Faye's face, Peter added, "It's a small glass."
"Oh."
Faye grinned and turned around to rifle through the shelves.
"You're funny, Mr. D. I like you."
"I'm funny," Peter mumbled, raising an eyebrow. Shrugging, he added aloud, "I'm glad to hear it, Miss Beam."
"Shucks, you can call me Faye."
"That's progress," Peter muttered. Faye bobbed over to an upright aluminum can, with a tap jammed in its side. It was only a serving to a great ape, but for a rat it was as good as a keg. Just a few drops greased the bottom of Peter's glass, but Faye filled her own up to the rim. It sloshed and splashed over the side as she sashayed back to Peter with a sparkle in her eye.
"Bottoms up, D-Man."
The two clicked glasses in an unspoken toast. "Peter is quite satisfactory, thank you."
"Oh."
Faye paused and then grinned.
"Well, how about Pete?"
"Quite fine, yes." Peter swallowed his drink and then swiveled about on his bar stool and tipped his cap back. The singers and dancing girls had returned to the stage, greeted with a great deal of commotion and whistling from the rats and mice in their audience. One rat, however, was not caught up in the celebration. The gray rat Peter had rescued was staring right at him, a curious glint in his eye. Peter simply raised his glass to the rat in answer. The rat responded by cracking a faint smirk. Then he looked away, brow furrowed, as he watched the show. No one noticed the crooked little form slipping out the door, one eye trained on his back and the other looking ahead. Mickey the Towel, so named for reasons not mentioned in polite company, darted in and out from among cardboard boxes and bags of garbage as he slipped silently to the nearest storm drain. He fastened a crude rope torn from the side of a trash bag around a bar in the grate and slipped down into the darkness. Mickey crept along slimy slabs of cement, around many a bend and fork in the dank sewer passages, until he arrived at his destination. There was a very large pipe, belching out chunky black water at odd intervals. A pair of white signs had been scribbled on either side, marking it out for Mickey and for others like him. The Twisted Mouse clambered up a nearby net that had been laid out just for this purpose, and climbed onto the top of the pipe. He then pressed his ear to the wall, listening intently for the telltale rumblings of wastewater in motion. When at last the pipe fell silent, Mickey slipped inside and began a long, difficult climb up through the waterworks. In time, Mickey emerged, spluttering and gasping for air in a porcelain bowl. Somewhere overhead there was a shout, and someone threw down a rope to haul Mickey out. As Mickey dropped onto the floor, he let out a cry of pain as he was blasted with scalding hot water. Once the grime of the streets and the sewers had been washed away, a rough set of hands hauled Mickey to his feet. Steam wafted from his shoulders as a pair of rats led Mickey away, through a towering, great ape-sized doorway, and into the empty room beyond. It had once been an apartment, occupied by one or more great apes, possibly a family. Now, however, the apartment was empty, a welcome home for rats, mice, and other less savory creatures. A group of cockroaches, for instance. They sat nearby, puffing away at little white rods, which they passed amongst themselves until the objects had burned away to nothing. But Mickey hadn't come to meet with roaches smoking roaches. His contact sat on the remains of the armrest of an overstuffed easy-chair, the last remnant of great ape furnishings in the apartment, facing a wood stove that burned bright with an active fire. Mickey couldn't quite see the dreaded Doc Chuck, nor did he want to. The gleam of fire off his silver, knife-like talons was quite enough. "Good evening, Mr. Lorry." Doc Chuck's voice came as a soft breath in greeting. Mickey gulped and forced an uneasy grin. "Good evening, Master." "You have news for me?" Mickey nodded, pausing as he recalled that Doc Chuck wasn't facing him. Yes. "An explanation, perhaps, why Murray and his biters haven't returned, but you have." "Oh, yes. Murray had Eddie pinned down until Peter Dane arrived." "Peter Dane," Doc Chuck repeated. "Please, my child, elaborate." "He pulled out a fancy gizmo and grabbed Murray's gun, and then he wrestled him down." "Impressive, this Peter Dane. Tell me more." "Eddie wants Murray to come back with a message and say..." "About Peter Dane." "Peter Dane?" Mickey blinked. "Everyone knows Peter Dane." "Indulge me." Mickey shrugged. "He was an inventor until he got greedy and ate all the cheese. Then our old boss tried to eliminate him, make an example for the others in case some of us got ideas." "An inventor, you say? Fascinating." "Oh, yes," Mickey agreed. "He made all kinds of nice things. Very nice." A faint chuckle bubbled from Doc Chuck's perch, setting Mickey's nerves on end. "Tell me, Mr. Lorry, how does our inventive friend like working for Eddie?" "It's hard to tell with Peter," Mickey explained, "but I don't think he does." "Good." "About Murray?" "Yes?" "Eddie wants him to tell everyone here they can go back any time. All is forgiven if they go back to the old gang." "Old gang?" a rat blurted out. "This is the old gang. This ain't Mr. Biggs, but we're the rats that made the place what it was." Doc Chuck stabbed his metal talons into the armrest, bringing a heavy silence down on the room. "Oh, don't be angry, please," Mickey urged. "Yes, this is an insult, a very nasty insult. He spat on the floor, punctuating the remark. "Ptoy!" But then he flashed a vicious grin.
"But it's also an opportunity."
"Elaborate," Doc Chuck exhaled. Mickey was silent for a moment, his lazy eye swiveling wildly as it scanned the room, while he waited for the angry murmur of voices to abate.
"We can send a group of men as spies, sleeper agents. Eddie won't know until it's too late."
A low chuckle answered Mickey's suggestion.
"Excellent. Do so."
No, not yet,"
Mickey exclaimed, waving his hands wildly. Pausing and grinning, he added,
"Murray hasn't come back, so how do we know about the offer?"
"Because you told us."
"But I'm not supposed to be here."
There was a short silence. At long last, Doc Chuck spoke again.
"Then we'll wait."
"Yes, wait. A very smart decision."
Doc Chuck dismissed Mickey with a gesture of his claws.
"Go back, then. Learn more. I want to know what Eddie has planned for this Peter Dane."
Mickey nodded, wringing his hands as he bobbed about. A pair of rats escorted him back into the bathroom. Once Mickey had climbed into the toilet, a team of rats manning a cord heaved their weight into a titanic pull. There was a loud flush, and Mickey was on his way back to the sewers. Climbing out of a storm drain, he gathered up his crude rope and, climbing up to the curb, returned to the alley. He took a moment near the building's drain pipe to wash himself off, and then scampered back to Mr. Biggs to keep watch.